Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving deep into a profound Eastern philosophical framework, specifically analyzing the escape from birth and death. The source texts we're looking at map out a really fascinating, esoteric roadmap for transcending the physical world and ultimately returning to what they call the true self. Listen to this striking quote from the teachings of Qigong. Humans live just for a breath. How many more times will you see the full moon? It's a pretty intense way to look at existence, right? Our entire lives literally balance on a temporary in and out breath. And that fragility perfectly sets the stage for why these traditions argue we absolutely must seek out a more permanent reality. Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start with the cycle of impermanence. Then, defining spiritual liberation. 3, why we must escape. 4, the path to liberation. 5, cultivation and vows. And finally, returning to the source. Let's jump right into section 1, this cycle of impermanence. Okay, so to understand the cure, we first have to understand the condition. The texts define impermanence, or anijjong, as the inescapable truth that literally everything with a physical form is eventually going to decay and die. According to this framework, our bodies are not our true selves. They're basically just temporary houses constructed from earth, water, wind, and fire. And because this house is temporary, it will inevitably collapse and return to the earth. Clinging to it is seen as the absolute root of human anxiety. And honestly, being stuck in that temporary house creates a ton of fear. The ancient philosopher Zhuangzi summed it up perfectly. He said, "Originally, I didn't want to be born, but suddenly I was born on this earth. Originally, I didn't want to die, but suddenly death comes." The texts describe humans and spirits as being trapped on this sort of involuntary Ferris wheel, just locked in an endless, dizzying loop of fear regarding birth and death. Moving on to section 2, defining spiritual liberation. As you can see, illustrated here, originally our souls were pure, luminous, and perfectly clear. But as we descended into this physical world, that true self got completely covered up by thick clouds of ignorance, worldly desires, and karma. Lost in that heavy fog, we became trapped in what the texts refer to as the sea of suffering, totally unable to see the path back to our original home. So, what does liberation actually mean in this context? Well, it's not just hoping for a pleasant afterlife. We're talking about an absolute, mechanical escape from the physical universe itself. It requires escaping the 5 elements, completely transcending the duality of yin and yang, and exiting the 4 forms of birth and the 6 paths of reincarnation, so you can return permanently to the origin. It's a total system override. Which brings us to section 3, why we must escape. This massive sense of urgency stems from a serious case of mistaken identity. The text draws a super sharp contrast between the false self, which is that temporary, decaying physical shell we're always worrying about, and the true self, which is the eternal, pure spiritual soul that originated from the Heavenly Mother. The core argument here is that clinging to the false self guarantees pain, while waking up and realizing the true self is what brings eternal peace. Because when we do cling to that physical shell, we basically drown in what the Buddha called the 8 sufferings. Life inherently ties us to birth, aging, sickness, and death. Plus, we face disappointment, being separated from what we love, encountering enemies, and carrying the heavy burden of the mental and physical aggregates. Because life absolutely guarantees these sufferings, escaping the cycle isn't just a nice idea, it's an urgent necessity. Let's look at section 4. The path to liberation. So how do we actually do this? The teachings break this esoteric journey down into 3 very concrete steps. Step 1, receiving the Tao through a specific transmission. Step 2, cultivating the self through daily work. And step 3, fulfilling vows by connecting your personal salvation to helping others. Now, receiving the Tao isn't just making a mental choice. The source texts describe it as a literal spiritual mechanic. It involves a formal ceremony where an enlightened master delivers the one pointing. Esoterically speaking, this portal-opening transmission instantly removes your name from the registry of the underworld and records it right up in heaven. Next up is section 5, cultivation and vows. But here's the catch. Having the door opened for you is entirely different from actually walking through it. The texts are super explicit about this, stating, receiving the Tao is escaping birth, but escaping death relies on your own cultivation. That initial transmission is really just the spark. Ultimate liberation requires your personal effort, deep repentance, and actively changing your bad habits. The source material outlines 5 exact conditions for doing this heavy lifting. To return to heaven, a practitioner must actively develop virtue. You have to strictly follow precepts to avoid creating any new karma. You need to maintain a positive, steadfast attitude, cultivate a serene fire of deep patience and good temperament, and finally, fulfill your vows to help save others. And you meet all these conditions through true repentance. Remember those thick clouds of earthly emotions and desires we talked about earlier? Well, once your karma is swept away by sincere self-reflection and a real change in behavior, it's like the clouds part, and the bright, pure moon of the true self can finally shine through again. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, returning to the source. This right here is the transcendent climax of these teachings. The ultimate goal is to permanently transcend this temporary, decaying world. It's about the soul finishing its incredibly arduous journey, finally shedding the false physical self, and returning to its eternal home with the Heavenly Mother, resting in eternal peace, completely free from the cycle forever. So now that you understand the mechanics of this profound philosophical framework, a pretty huge question remains. What will you do with your temporary breath to secure your eternal soul? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep asking the big questions.